access granted. In 1911, the United States government finally defeated John D. Rockefeller. For decades, his company had grown into one of the most powerful industrial organizations America had ever seen. Standard Oil had once controlled close to 90% of the nation's oil refining. Politicians investigated it, journalists exposed it, the federal government sued it, and eventually, the Supreme Court ordered the empire broken apart. 34 separate companies emerged from the wreckage. The monopoly was dead. Rockefeller had lost. At least, that was the idea. Because 5 years later, John D. Rockefeller was being described as the world's first billionaire. The government had broken his company apart, and somehow, Rockefeller had become richer. So this story isn't really about how Rockefeller built a monopoly. It's about something stranger. What did Rockefeller own that the government couldn't destroy? To answer that, we have to go back. But not to Rockefeller's childhood, not even to an oil well, to a ledger. Before Rockefeller became an oil magnate, he was a bookkeeper. Numbers were his first language. Costs, margins, interest, waste. Every cent entering a business, and every cent leaving it. That sounds almost boring. It wasn't. Because when the American oil industry exploded in the 1860s, most people were looking at the obvious opportunity. The oil itself. Pennsylvania was producing something the world suddenly wanted in enormous quantities. Entrepreneurs rushed to drill. Speculators rushed to buy. Refineries appeared almost overnight. Everyone wanted the black liquid coming out of the ground. Rockefeller looked somewhere else. Because finding oil was unpredictable. A well could make you rich, or produce nothing. Prices could soar, then collapse. New producers could appear almost instantly. Rockefeller wasn't particularly interested in winning that game. He wanted a business where uncertainty could be reduced. So instead of betting primarily on discovering oil, he focused on refining it, turning crude oil into products people could actually use. By 1865, after buying out the Clark brothers for $72,500, Rockefeller gained control of the Cleveland refining business he had entered with his partners. And then he began doing something that would define nearly everything that came afterward. He attacked waste. He reused byproducts other refiners discarded. He manufactured his own barrels. He bought timber. He dried the wood before transporting it to reduce weight. He reinvested aggressively. Every unnecessary cost was a weakness. Every dependency was a risk. And every fraction of a cent, multiplied across thousands of barrels, became real money. But efficiency created a new problem. You could make oil cheaply. You could refine it perfectly. None of that mattered if you couldn't move it. Before pipelines became dominant, refined oil depended heavily on railroads. And railroads had a problem of their own. A train that leaves half empty still costs money to run. So railroads didn't just want customers. They wanted volume they could predict. Rockefeller could give them that. A small refiner might ship occasionally. Rockefeller could promise large quantities again, and again, and again. In 1868, he secured a major arrangement guaranteeing shipment volume in exchange for railroad rebates. Similar arrangements followed. Now imagine you're one of his competitors. You buy crude oil at roughly the same market price. You refine it using similar equipment. You sell kerosene to similar customers. But before either product reaches the market, Rockefeller's barrel costs less to transport. You haven't necessarily made a mistake. Your product isn't necessarily worse. The game simply costs you more to play, and that's where Rockefeller discovered something much more powerful than cheap oil. You don't always have to control the product. Sometimes, you control the conditions surrounding it. And once you understand that, the industry starts to look very different. By 1870, Rockefeller and his partners had incorporated Standard Oil of Ohio. It controlled around 10% of American petroleum refining. 10% was enormous for a young company, but it still meant 90% belonged to someone else. Then came a proposed arrangement called the South Improvement Company. The concept tied major refiners and railroads together through preferential freight arrangements. Favored refiners would receive rebates on their own shipments, and proposed drawbacks meant participants could benefit from charges associated with shipments made by outsiders. In other words, the advantage wasn't simply that Standard Oil might pay less. Competitors could effectively face a system tilted against them. When details became public, oil producers erupted. The scheme became toxic. Pennsylvania revoked the company's charter before it completed a single transaction. It looked like a major defeat for Rockefeller, but something important had already happened. While everyone was fighting the agreement, Rockefeller was consolidating Cleveland. In less than 6 weeks in early 1872, Standard Oil acquired 22 of the city's 26 competing refineries. Think about that. The controversial deal failed. The advantage it promised became politically impossible. And yet Rockefeller emerged from the episode more powerful than before. This would not be the last time. Once Standard Oil became larger, something dangerous happened. Scale started feeding itself. More refining capacity meant more barrels. More barrels meant more predictable freight. More freight meant more negotiating power with railroads. Better transportation economics meant lower costs. Lower costs gave Standard more room to cut prices. Competitors operating with thinner margins came under pressure. Some sold. Some joined Standard Oil. Some disappeared. And every acquisition increased Standard's scale again. The loop repeated. Scale, leverage, lower costs, more scale. This is the point where Rockefeller's story is usually summarized with one word: monopoly. But monopoly describes where the system ended. It doesn't explain how the system worked, because Rockefeller was about to remove an even bigger weakness: the railroad. Rockefeller had learned a lesson. If someone else controls something your business cannot function without, they have power over you. So Standard Oil increasingly pushed into the infrastructure surrounding refining: pipelines, tank cars, storage facilities, distribution, barrels, materials, transportation. The company became more vertically integrated, reducing its dependence on outsiders and capturing efficiencies throughout the system. PBS's historical account notes that Rockefeller even owned timber, cooperative operations, and transport resources associated with barrel production. Now picture a competitor trying to fight Standard Oil. You're not simply fighting another refinery anymore. You're fighting a company that may move oil more cheaply, store it more efficiently, turn waste into revenue, survive lower margins, reach more markets, and negotiate from a position you cannot match. Standard Oil wasn't becoming powerful because one refinery was extraordinary. It was becoming powerful because the pieces reinforced one another. And by the late 1870s, Standard Oil controlled close to 90% of American refining capacity. Rockefeller had solved competition, or at least, he had solved the version of competition he could see. Because now his empire had become so large that it faced a problem no refinery could fix. It was becoming difficult to legally hold together. Standard Oil operated across state lines. But corporate law in the 19th century was fragmented. The organization Rockefeller had built was spreading across corporations, partnerships, and properties in different jurisdictions. The economic empire existed. The legal structure holding it together was becoming increasingly awkward. So Rockefeller's lawyers changed the architecture. In 1882, stock from 40 corporations and other properties was placed under the control of 9 trustees. Those trustees held the assets for the benefit of certificate holders. This became the Standard Oil Trust. Different businesses, different legal entities, different locations, centralized control. And Rockefeller himself held more than 1/3 of the trust certificates. This is the moment the story stops being about oil. Because Rockefeller had built something more abstract, a way to separate the visible companies from the control sitting above them. Factories could have different names, corporations could exist in different states, operations could appear fragmented, but the economic interests could still be coordinated. And that distinction between the company and the ownership behind the company is going to become very important. Just not yet, because Standard Oil had another problem. For decades, most Americans couldn't see exactly how the machine worked. Then someone explained it to them. Her name was Ida Tarbell, and she knew the oil industry personally. Her father had worked in Pennsylvania's oil business, and Tarbell had grown up during the conflict surrounding Standard Oil's rise and the South Improvement Company. Decades later, she began investigating Rockefeller's empire, not with rumors, with records, court testimony, government investigations, corporate history, railroad arrangements, business practices. Her series in McClure's magazine became the history of the Standard Oil Company. Tarbell didn't create Standard Oil's enemies. What she did was more dangerous. She made the system understandable. The rebates, the acquisitions, the consolidation, the corporate structure, the things that had once looked like isolated business decisions could now be viewed as parts of one machine. And a machine people can understand is a machine politicians can attack. In 1906, the federal government brought its antitrust case against Standard Oil. The fight lasted years, and this time, Rockefeller couldn't buy the problem. He couldn't lower a price until it disappeared. He couldn't acquire the Supreme Court. By 1911, the structure that had held his empire together was approaching judgment. May 15, 1911. The United States Supreme Court ruled against Standard Oil. The court held that the combination violated the Sherman Antitrust Act and ordered it dissolved. The organization was separated into 34 companies. After decades of consolidation, the direction reversed. One became 34. The structure Rockefeller had spent a lifetime building was broken. This is where the story is supposed to end. The monopoly loses. The government wins. Competition returns. Rockefeller pays the price. And for a moment, let's assume that's exactly what happened. Because the federal government really did achieve something significant. Standard Oil could no longer operate as the single integrated combination it had been. The legal structure was dismantled. The monopoly was broken apart. But then, ask one question. When Standard Oil became 34 companies, who owned the pieces? Rockefeller was no longer running Standard Oil's daily operations by then, but he remained a major shareholder. And breaking a corporation into separate companies does not automatically erase the ownership of the people who held it. Instead, shareholders received interests in the successor companies. The company had been divided. Rockefeller's economic exposure to its assets had not simply vanished. He now held stakes across the pieces. And look at what the government had actually separated. Refineries, pipelines, distribution networks, brands, infrastructure, organizations. They were no longer unified under the old Standard Oil structure. But none of those assets stopped existing on May 15, 1911. The refineries still refined. The pipelines still moved petroleum. The distribution systems still served customers. And Americans still needed oil. In fact, they were about to need much more of it. Because the product that had originally built Rockefeller's empire was changing. Kerosene had illuminated 19th century nights, but the 20th century was beginning to run on something else. Gasoline. Automobiles were transforming the economics of petroleum, and Rockefeller owned interests in companies positioned directly inside that transition. The legal monopoly had been broken, the economic assets remained, and as the successor companies gained value, so did Rockefeller's holdings. The breakup that was supposed to diminish his empire became a financial windfall. By 1916, newspapers were reporting that Rockefeller had crossed the billion-dollar threshold. The Library of Congress notes that the Supreme Court case had not slowed his fortune, and that 1916 headlines announced him as the world's first billionaire. Now, we can finally answer the question from the beginning. What did Rockefeller own that the government couldn't destroy? Not Standard Oil. Not exactly. He owned claims on the productive system underneath it. This is where Rockefeller becomes less interesting, and the mechanism becomes more interesting. We tend to imagine power as something visible, a corporation, a headquarters, a brand, a monopoly. So when the corporation is dismantled, we expect the power to disappear with it. But corporations are structures. Underneath them are things that can survive structural change. Assets, infrastructure, ownership, scale, contracts, networks, knowledge, distribution, demand. The government dismantled Standard Oil's centralized legal architecture. It did not destroy the refineries. It did not destroy the pipelines. It did not eliminate petroleum demand. And it did not confiscate Rockefeller's legitimate ownership interests in the businesses created from the breakup. So, the structure changed. The underlying economic machine kept running, and Rockefeller owned part of it. That's the paradox. The government attacked the concentration of corporate control. It didn't reset the economic world Rockefeller had spent decades building. One company became many. One block of ownership became interests in multiple companies, and those pieces could become more valuable than the whole had been before. Rockefeller's greatest advantage wasn't that he understood oil better than everyone else. He understood dependence. At first, refiners depended on railroads, so scale gave him leverage over railroads. Then Standard depended on suppliers, so Standard absorbed more of the supply chain. Then his growing empire depended on a fragile corporate structure. So the structure became a trust. Every time Rockefeller encountered a dependency, he tried to move control one layer deeper, and that is why 1911 matters. The government looked at the visible structure and broke it apart. Legally, it won. But the assets beneath that structure survived. The demand survived. The infrastructure survived, and most importantly, the ownership survived. The company was broken. The ownership wasn't. Power is easy to recognize when it has a name, a headquarters, and a logo. It is much harder to recognize after those things disappear, because power rarely disappears with the structure that made it visible. Sometimes, it simply changes shape.